it to the screen. So now this is my first time where I'm like, okay, we're getting close. So I'm finally starting to paint with code. Can I get the light on me down a little bit, because I know this is a little bit nicer. So all I'm doing here is taking a movie clip with varying opacities and drawing it to the stage, and then adding values of inertia, much like that particle emitter in the previous example. And then the result is just sort of like a paint smudge. I mean, this to me is like interesting, and it's getting somewhere. It starts to feel a little bit painterly, but realistically, it's not, you know, it's not much beyond what I could do probably in Photoshop in 2 seconds with a paint depth filter added to something. So it's a good sort of starting point, but I knew I wanted to create within Flash something that was a little bit more unique. So I've been going down this road of creating ribbons within Flash. One of the earlier projects that I did, I think back in 2002, was for the Pontiac Vibe, where I was commissioned to create a piece that represented sort of performance of a car. And to me, performance, I was thinking of light streaming by, so I wanted to create these ribbons. And so I created these ribbons that reacted to sound, and at that time I still wasn't able to pull in color data, so I'm just referencing color array sets. So here's just a red and different hues of it. And then I would change the opacity and so forth, but it was very limited. And probably 2 years ago I was commissioned to create a piece for a book, and the book was called Love Days. So I decided I would take the woman that I love the most and use her image as a reference for taking these ribbons that I was creating, and now push that system a little bit further into actually painting. So changing out different values to either make her image a little bit more apparent or a little bit more abstracted. So here's the process that I went through, which was just essentially, I had 20 different ribbons that were following me, and I'd click and draw to the stage where I knew I wanted to draw. So now I was capturing gesture. Now ribbons were following me in a swarming pattern, and I could actually sort of get this feeling like I was working with a paintbrush. And because I was doing it as PostScript, when I release the mouse, I'm actually, hey, thank you. When I release the mouse, it gets rid of a lot of the PostScript data visually, but it's still there. So what I end up with is this very large file at the end that I then bring into Illustrator. For those that haven't ever done sort of PostScript into Illustrator, all I'm doing is exporting print to PDF or print to PostScript, and then just re-importing it. And the thing that I really love about this process is that regardless of scale, I don't lose any of the detail. Just showing sort of the structure. This is generally how I create most projects. I show a lot of source files in iterative form, and that's generally how I work. I don't build a lot of classes, but to break down that process of creating a ribbon, I just wanted to show a few source files that I created just to break down that process, where I'm doing just a general like mouse trailer where I'm putting particles to the stage where my mouse is, and then adding energy to those particles. And while I want them to have a little bit more of a cohesiveness, I want the ribbon to have a solid structure, so I add gravity to it. So now it has a little bit of energy, and gravity pulls it together. In this example, I have the ground state, so in case I wanted to actually have the floor. And here I'm adding friction to it, just so that it doesn't sort of go all over the place. One of the things that I show in the FLA is that I like using radians as a sort of a point of trajectory. I don't necessarily like giving X and Y speeds at random. I like to actually have it going around, because you end up with a much more organic shape as a result. So that's one of the little tricks that I like to include in there. But then the next stage is like, how do you tie it all together? So now we take our particles that are falling to the ground, and we connect them with lines. But the lines themselves, if I move the mouse too much, move too far apart. So in the next section, you'll see that I add a limiting factor. I add a condition where if the particle is more than 100 pixels away, keep it restricted to its neighbor. So I I basically add a sort of a neighboring behavior so that it constricts it. And eventually I'll take that value for the difference between the two and add an x and y speed to it so that adds some inertia. And the next thing that I'll do is that I don't want there to be kinks in that curve. So you'll notice that the particles that I was originally placing down are now added to it with red points, which were midpoints. And in the next illustration, I'm going to show essentially how that comes about. If you think about these blue points as being the particles on the stage, I'm just trying to figure out where the midpoint is. So if I average out the x and y from both neighboring points, I get a midpoint to each of those. And then you can see that, well, I know now those midpoints or anchor points have been flashed. And the points that were on the stage were actually curve points. So this is a kind of a trick that I came about just playing around with code. I mean, I don't generally read a lot. Most of the things that I just try and approach is in an experimental fashion. And this was one of those happy accidents that I've now really sort of embraced in pretty much all the projects I do. So you can see that that curve is now continuous. So anytime I draw those points, that curve will always be a smooth curve. Now applying that to a ribbon structure, I then take those points that are the x points and I project a radius because I want to be able to add a thickness to it. I don't want to just make a line style that goes all the way through. So I add a projecting radius for the points that are my curves as well as the points that are my midpoints, and then you tie it all together with a curve 2 and a line 2, and you end up actually creating the ribbon. So here's that sort of initial stage, and now you're starting to see that ribbon has inertia that I was talking about, where when I pull it, it has a little bit more of a life to it, essentially. Oops. Get a